The phone rang at exactly 3 a.m., its sharp sound tearing through the silence of the night, and before I even reached for it, a heavy dread settled in my chest. Calls at that hour never bring good news. My hands shook as I answered, and on the other end was my son's voice, strained, hollow, nothing like the confident man I knew. He wasn't crying, but somehow that made it worse. There was a long pause, the kind where you can hear someone fighting to hold themselves together, and then he said quietly, "Dad, I can't do this anymore." In that moment, 1,000 thoughts crashed into my mind. I thought of his wedding day, the pride I felt watching him stand tall beside the woman he promised to spend his life with. I thought of how certain I was that he was happy, how every time I asked about married life, he said he was fine. Now, in the darkness of the early morning, I realized how wrong I had been. As he spoke, broken sentences spilling out between heavy breaths, I understood that his marriage hadn't just gone through rough patches. It had become a place of fear, confusion, and emotional exhaustion. Listening to him at 3 a.m., hearing the weight in his voice, I felt a painful mix of shock, guilt, and helplessness. I should have seen the signs. I should have asked harder questions. But above all else, I knew one thing with terrifying clarity: whatever had been happening behind closed doors had finally reached a breaking point. And my son was calling me because he had nowhere else left to turn. He arrived just before dawn, the sky still dark but thinning at the edges, as if the night itself was reluctant to let go. I heard his car before I saw him, the familiar engine sounding wrong, somehow slower, uncertain. When he stepped inside, I barely recognized him. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, his movements heavy, like every step required effort. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, keys dangling loosely from his fingers, staring at the floor as if it might open up and swallow him. I pulled him into a hug, and for a second he resisted, stiff with pride. Then he collapsed against me in a way I hadn't felt since he was a child. That was when I knew this wasn't just stress or a bad argument. This was something that had been breaking him for a long time. We sat at the kitchen table as the first light crept through the window. I poured coffee out of habit, though neither of us touched it. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until he finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled, but every word sounded like it was being dragged out of him. He told me he hadn't slept in days. That every night felt like walking into a storm he couldn't predict. He said he was tired of feeling wrong all the time, tired of apologizing for things he didn't understand, tired of being told he was the problem. As he spoke, I felt a tightening in my chest, a slow realization dawning that this wasn't about one fight or one mistake. This was about erosion, his confidence, his joy, his sense of self, worn down piece by piece. He talked about the early days of his marriage, how happy he had been, how proud. He believed he was building a life, a partnership. But gradually, things shifted. Conversations turned into interrogations. Disagreements became personal attacks. He began doubting his own memory, his own intentions. If he defended himself, he was accused of being cold. If he stayed quiet, he was accused of not caring. No matter what he did, it was never enough. As he described it, I realized how carefully trapped he had been, not by force, but by confusion. By the constant sense that if he could just say the right thing, be a little more patient, try a little harder, everything would be okay. There was a moment he described that stayed with me. He said there were nights he would sit in his car after work, engine off, staring at the dashboard, trying to gather the strength to go inside. Not because he feared physical harm, but because he feared the emotional onslaught, the accusations, the twisting of words, the endless cycle of blame. He said it felt like being slowly suffocated, like drowning without making a sound. Hearing my son describe his own home as a place he dreaded filled me with a quiet, simmering anger I struggled to contain. When I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner, he gave a sad, almost embarrassed smile. He said he didn't think anyone would understand. He said men aren't supposed to admit they feel trapped, or scared, or emotionally broken. He said he kept telling himself it wasn't that bad, that other people had it worse, that he should be able to handle it. That sentence hurt the most. The idea that he had been measuring his pain against some invisible standard, convincing himself he didn't deserve help, made my heart ache. I realized then how deeply silence can wound, especially when it's reinforced by shame. As the morning went on, more pieces fell into place. He described the fight that led to the 3 a.m. phone call not explosive, not dramatic, but devastating in its own way. She had accused him of things he hadn't done, questioned his loyalty, his character, his worth. When he tried to leave the room to cool down, she followed him, blocking the doorway, demanding answers he didn't have. Something inside him finally snapped not into anger, but into clarity. He said he felt empty, numb. And that scared him more than any argument ever had. That was when he realized staying was costing him something he might not be able to get back. I listened without interrupting, my mind racing with memories of him growing up, his stubborn kindness, his quiet strength, the way he always tried to do the right thing. I wondered how I had missed the signs. How many times I had laughed off his tiredness, his distance, telling myself marriage was just an adjustment. That guilt settled heavily on my shoulders, but I pushed it aside. This moment wasn't about my regrets. It was about him finally being heard. By the time the sun fully rose, he looked drained but lighter, as if saying the words out loud had loosened something inside him. He leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and said softly, "I don't know who I am anymore." I reached across the table and took his hand, grounding him, reminding him that whoever he had been made to feel like, it wasn't the truth. I told him he wasn't weak for feeling this way. He was human. And for the first time since he arrived, I saw his shoulders lift slightly, as if that simple acknowledgement had given him permission to breathe. That morning marked the beginning of something difficult and uncertain, but also necessary. The nightmare hadn't ended yet, not by a long shot. But my son had taken the first step out of the darkness by making that call at 3 a.m. And as I watched him finally fall asleep on the couch, exhaustion overtaking him, I understood that this story wasn't just about a marriage gone wrong, it was about a man learning, painfully and bravely, that survival sometimes starts with asking for help. The afternoon passed quietly, but inside the house, everything felt charged, as if the walls themselves were listening. When my son woke up, the emptiness in his eyes had softened. Replaced by something heavier reflection, we sat together again. This time not at the kitchen table, but in the living room. Sunlight falling across the floor in long, honest lines that left nowhere to hide. He stared at his hands as if they belonged to someone else, turning them over slowly, and then he began to talk again, this time not about the end, but about the beginning. He said he needed me to understand how it all went wrong, not suddenly, but quietly, almost invisibly. He told me how, in the first months of marriage, everything had seemed normal, even beautiful. She was attentive, deeply involved in his life, always wanting to know where he was, who he spoke to, what he was thinking. At first, he thought it was love. He felt chosen, important. When she questioned his plans or expressed discomfort with certain friends, he believed she was simply trying to build a strong bond. So he adjusted. He cancelled outings. He stopped answering messages as quickly. He told himself compromise was part of being a good husband. Over time, those small adjustments became expectations. If he stayed late at work, it wasn't dedication, it was suspicion. If he wanted a quiet evening alone, it wasn't exhaustion, it was rejection. Every choice he made seemed to require explanation, justification, reassurance. He said it felt like living under a microscope, every movement examined, every word replayed. When he tried to express how overwhelmed he felt, she turned it round, accusing him of being distant, of not loving her enough, slowly, without realizing it. He stopped speaking up. He described moments that sounded harmless on the surface but carried a deep sting. Sarcastic remarks disguised as jokes, comparisons to other husbands who were more attentive or more successful, subtle reminders that he was lucky she tolerated his flaws. Each comment alone seemed insignificant, but together they formed a constant background noise that chipped away at him. He began to doubt his worth, his competence, even his memory. When arguments ended, he was always the one apologizing, even when he wasn't sure what he had done wrong. As he spoke, I noticed how carefully he chose his words, as if still afraid of being misunderstood or blamed. He admitted there were days he would rehearse conversations in his head before speaking to her, trying to predict what might upset her, what tone would keep the peace. He said it felt like performing a role in his own life, never fully present, always guarded. That exhaustion, he explained, was worse than anger. Anger burns hot and fast. This was cold, constant, draining. One evening stood out in his memory. He had been invited to a close friend's birthday, something he had already agreed to attend weeks earlier. When he reminded her, she went quiet. No argument, no raised voice, just silence, the kind that fills a room and presses against your chest. When he finally asked what was wrong, she said calmly that if he loved her, he wouldn't want to be anywhere else. He cancelled his plans without another word. Sitting there now, he shook his head and said that was the night he realized how small his world had become. I felt a wave of anger rise in me. Not explosive, but deep and steady, not just at her, but at the situation that had taught my son to shrink himself to survive. I wanted to interrupt, to tell him none of this was okay, but I knew he needed to say it all out loud, to hear his own story without interruption. So I listened, even when it hurt. He told me about the loneliness that followed. How even when she was sitting right beside him, he felt utterly alone. How he stopped sharing his thoughts because they were either dismissed or used against him later. How he missed the person he used to be, the man who laughed easily, who spoke without fear, who didn't second-guess every emotion. At some point, he said, he stopped recognizing himself in the mirror. That admission broke something open in me. No parent ever wants to hear that their child has been living as a stranger to themselves. As evening approached, his voice grew quieter, more reflective. He said the hardest part wasn't the arguments or the accusations, it was the constant feeling of being wrong, wrong for wanting space, wrong for needing rest, wrong for feeling hurt. He said he had begun to believe that maybe this was all he deserved. That sentence hung in the air between us, heavy and unbearable. I reached over and placed my hand on his shoulder, grounding him again, silently promising that this belief would not go unchallenged. That day ended with more questions than answers, but also with something new, a shared understanding. He wasn't imagining things. He wasn't weak. He had been slowly, systematically worn down, and now, finally, he was beginning to see it for what it was. As the lights dimmed and the house settled into quiet, I knew this chapter of his story was painful to relive, but necessary, because before he could escape the nightmare, he had to fully see how it had been built. The next day unfolded with a strange stillness, the kind that settles in after something heavy has been spoken aloud. My son spent most of the morning pacing the house, stopping at windows, stepping outside, then coming back in again, as if he didn't quite know where he belonged. It was in those restless movements that I began to understand how deeply the marriage had trained him to feel unsettled, even in a place meant to be safe. By the afternoon, he finally sat down again, his back straight, his hands folded tightly in his lap, and said there was more I needed to know, not about how it began, but about what it became. He explained that after the control took root, the emotional games grew sharper. Arguments no longer stayed in the moment. They were stored, reshaped, and brought back weeks later as proof of his supposed failures if he forgot something small. It was used as evidence that he didn't care if he remembered too much. He was accused of keeping score. He said conversations felt like traps. No matter what he said, it could later be turned against him. Over time, he stopped trusting his own reactions. He wondered if he really was as careless, as selfish as she said. That doubt, he told me, was the most dangerous thing of all. He described evenings when she would suddenly withdraw affection without explanation. No eye contact, no response, just cold distance that lasted for hours or days. When he asked what was wrong, she told him he should already know, so he searched his memory endlessly, replaying every word, every look, trying to identify the invisible mistake. When he guessed wrong, it made things worse. He said it felt like being punished for a crime without ever being told what the law was. Listening to him, I realized how psychological pain doesn't leave marks you can see, but it can still reshape a person from the inside out. There were moments, he said, when things seemed to improve. Apologies came. Promises were made. She would be warm again, attentive, even loving. Those brief calm periods kept him hopeful, convinced that if he just held on a little longer, things would finally stabilize. But the peace never lasted. It always dissolved into another cycle of tension, blame, and emotional withdrawal. He compared it to standing on a bridge that kept cracking beneath his feet, yet being told the bridge was perfectly fine and that he was the problem for feeling afraid. As his father, hearing this stirred something primal in me. I felt protective anger rise, but also a crushing sadness. I saw how carefully the situation had cornered him, how each attempt to fix things only deepened the trap. He told me he stopped reaching out to friends because it caused arguments. Family gatherings became stressful, filled with scrutiny and silent judgment. Slowly, his world narrowed until it revolved entirely around managing her moods. The isolation wasn't forced, it was engineered. He admitted there were nights he lay awake replaying conversations, wondering if he was losing his mind. He searched online for answers, but every article he found seemed to talk about abuse in ways that didn't fit his situation exactly. There were no bruises, no shouting matches the neighbors could hear, just a steady erosion of confidence, clarity, and peace. He said that uncertainty kept him silent. He didn't want to exaggerate. He didn't want to accuse. He just wanted the pain to stop. At one point, his voice faltered. He said there were days he thought about leaving, but the fear of what that meant held him back. Fear of judgment. Fear of failure. Fear of being blamed for breaking the marriage. He said he worried no one would believe him, that people would assume he was hiding something worse. That fear, he confessed, kept him stuck far longer than he wanted to admit. I reminded him that abuse doesn't always look the way people expect, and that confusion is often the point. That didn't erase the pain, but it softened the shame he carried. That night, after he went to bed, I sat alone in the quiet house, replaying his words. I thought about how many people live inside stories like his, unseen and unheard, because their suffering doesn't fit a simple narrative. Chapter by chapter, his marriage hadn't just changed his life, it had rewritten his sense of reality. And now, as difficult as it was, we were finally reading that story together, clearly. Without excuses. By the fourth day, the house felt different again, heavier somehow, as if it knew we were approaching the part of the story my son had been avoiding. He didn't bring it up right away. We went through the motions of a normal day, simple meals, small talk, a walk around the block, but there was a tension in him that never eased. That evening, as the sky darkened and the familiar quiet settled in, he finally sat across from me and said softly that there was one night he hadn't told me about yet. His voice didn't shake, but his hands did, and I knew this was the moment everything truly changed for him. He explained that the arguments had been escalating for weeks before the phone call at 3 a.m. Not louder, not more dramatic, just more relentless. There was no recovery time anymore. One accusation flowed into another, and even when they stopped talking, the tension stayed. Thick and unbreakable that night. He came home later than usual because of an unexpected issue at work. He had texted to explain, had even sent a photo as proof. But when he walked through the door, he could feel the anger waiting for him like a living thing. At first, she didn't yell. She sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on him, asking questions in a calm, measured tone that felt more frightening than shouting. Where exactly had he been? Why didn't he answer immediately? Who else was there? He answered everything honestly, carefully, choosing each word the way one handles glass, but the questions kept coming, looping back on themselves, contradictions forming where there were none. He realized then that this wasn't about answers, it was about control, as the conversation dragged on. Something inside him shifted. He felt a strange detachment, like he was watching himself from a distance. He told me that was the first time he noticed the numbness, the absence of emotion where fear or anger should have been, when he tried to step away to end the argument. She followed him from room to room. Refusing to let the moment end, she accused him of trying to escape responsibility, of hiding something, of abandoning her emotionally. Each word landed with the weight of an accusation that couldn't be disproven. He said there was a moment when she stood in front of the doorway, arms crossed, blocking his path, not touching him, not threatening him, but making it clear that leaving the room wasn't an option. In that moment, something clicked with terrifying clarity. He understood that even without physical force, he was trapped. That realization sent a cold wave through him, sharper than panic. He felt small, powerless, and deeply alone in a place that was supposed to be home, eventually. The argument ended the way they all did, with him apologizing, not because he believed he was wrong, but because he wanted it to stop. He retreated into silence, sitting on the edge of the bed while she turned away, her anger unresolved but temporarily quiet. He told me that was when the thought crossed his mind for the first time. Clear and unmistakable, if he stayed, this would never end, and worse. It would keep taking pieces of him until there was nothing left to give. What followed was the longest night of his life. He didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her breathing beside him, feeling more alone than he ever had. He thought about all the compromises he had made, all the excuses he had created for behavior he never would have accepted before. He thought about how much he had changed, how cautious he had become, how quiet, how distant from the person he once recognized. And in that silence, he felt something that frightened him more than any argument: resignation. By morning, he said he felt hollow. Not angry, not sad. Just empty. He went to work like nothing was wrong, smiled at people, answered emails, played his role. But inside, he felt disconnected from his own life. That emotional emptiness followed him for days, growing heavier, until the smallest trigger could set it off. He said he realized then that the marriage wasn't just hurting him, it was erasing him. The night of the 3 a.m. call came shortly after. Another argument, another spiral of accusations, another attempt to explain himself that went nowhere. This time, though, when she told him that everything wrong in their marriage was his fault, something inside him finally broke not into rage, but into truth. He felt a sudden, overwhelming certainty that no amount of effort would ever be enough, that staying wouldn't fix anything, that the cost of remaining was his sanity. He left the house without a plan, driving aimlessly through empty streets, the city dark and silent around him. He pulled over at one point, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. That was when he realized he couldn't do this alone anymore. The shame that had kept him quiet for so long finally gave way to survival. And so, at 3 a.m., with his hands shaking and his chest tight, he called me. As he finished telling me this, the room was silent. I could hear the clock ticking, each second marking how long he had carried this alone. I felt a surge of emotions: anger, sorrow, guilt, but above all, fierce resolve. I told him that what he had experienced was real, that his pain didn't need permission to exist, and that reaching out hadn't been a failure. It had been an act of courage. That night he described wasn't just the breaking point of his marriage. It was the moment he chose himself, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. And as hard as it was to hear, I knew this chapter mattered. Because before healing could begin, he had to confront the truth of what staying had cost him and why leaving had become the only way forward. The days that followed were no longer just about listening, they were about action. I could see it in my son's posture, the way he stood a little straighter each morning. Even as fear still lingered behind his eyes, the truth had been spoken now. And once truth is out in the open, it demands a response. We talked about practical things at first, almost awkwardly, as if discussing logistics might keep the emotions from spilling over again. Where would he stay? What would he tell people? What if she called or showed up? Each question carried weight, not just because of the answers, but because asking them meant accepting that the marriage he had fought to save was no longer safe to return to. He admitted that part of him still hoped for a message, an apology that would finally sound sincere, a promise that would actually mean change. I didn't judge him for that. Hope is stubborn, especially when it's tied to the life you once imagined. But I gently reminded him of the pattern he himself had described, the calm after the storm, the apologies that never lasted, the cycle that always reset. Saying that out loud seemed to harden something in him, not in bitterness, but in clarity. He nodded slowly, as if locking a door inside himself that he had kept reopening for too long. We began making calls together, a trusted friend first. Then another. Each conversation was difficult. His voice hesitant as he tried to explain without defending himself. But something unexpected happened. He wasn't met with disbelief or ridicule. He was met with concern, with quiet understanding, with people saying, "That sounds really hard," instead of asking what he did wrong. I watched his face after those calls, the way relief softened his features. It was the first proof that the story he had been telling himself that no one would understand wasn't true. There were moments when the weight of it all hit him suddenly. One afternoon, while sorting through a few clothes he had brought with him, he froze, staring at a shirt I knew she had once bought him. His hands tightened, and for a second I thought he might tear it apart. Instead, he sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. He said quietly that leaving felt like erasing his own life, that everything reminded him of promises he had meant when he made them. I sat beside him, saying nothing. Letting the silence do what words couldn't. Grief, I realized, doesn't only belong to endings that are gentle, it also belongs to endings that are necessary. That evening, we talked about professional help, something he had resisted for a long time, not because he didn't believe in it, but because he was afraid of what it would confirm, sitting there. He finally admitted he was tired of carrying this alone. The decision to reach out for therapy wasn't dramatic, but it was monumental. It was him acknowledging that the damage was real and that healing would take more than time, it would take intention. When he said he was willing to try, I felt a quiet pride swell in my chest. She did cool. Eventually, his phone buzzed on the table between us. Her name lighting up the screen like a test neither of us had studied for. He stared at it, unmoving, breath shallow. I didn't tell him what to do. I didn't have to. After a long moment, he turned the phone face down. That small action carried more strength than any argument ever could. Later, when the messages came, apologies mixed with blame, affection tangled with accusation, he read them with a distance I hadn't seen before. He wasn't absorbed by them. He wasn't scrambling to respond. He was observing, finally able to see the pattern without being pulled back into it. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes. He slept longer, more deeply. He laughed once, unexpectedly, at something on television, and then looked almost surprised by the sound of it. He started talking about things unrelated to the marriage, work ideas, trips he had postponed, hobbies he had abandoned. These weren't signs that the pain was gone. They were signs that space was forming around it, room to breathe, room to imagine something beyond survival. We also talked about boundaries, real ones, not the fragile kind he had tried to set before. Boundaries that didn't require explanation or permission. He struggled with that concept at first, conditioned as he was to justify every decision. But slowly, he began to understand that protecting his peace wasn't cruelty, it was care. Each time he chose not to engage, not to argue, not to reopen old wounds, he was choosing himself in a way he never had before. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sky darken, he said something that told me how far he had come. He said he no longer felt like he was running away. He felt like he was stepping toward something even if he didn't yet know what that something was. His voice was steady when he said it, not hopeful in a naive way, but grounded. Real. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple. There would be setbacks, doubts, moments when the past tried to pull him back. Healing is never a straight line, but as I listened to him speak that night, I saw the beginnings of resilience taking shape, not loud or dramatic, quiet, patient, determined. This chapter of his story wasn't about victory or closure. It was about choosing safety over familiarity, truth over denial, and self-respect over fear. Watching my son take those steps, however tentative, I understood that the nightmare hadn't ended yet, but it was losing its power, and for the first time since that phone rang at 3 a.m., I believed, deeply and without hesitation, that he was going to be okay. Time didn't heal everything, but it changed the way the pain lived inside him. Weeks passed, then months. And the house that had once felt like a temporary shelter slowly became a place of rebuilding. My son moved with more certainty now. The hesitation in his steps faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that didn't ask for approval. He still had difficult days when memories surfaced without warning, when a sound or a phrase pulled him back into old emotions, but those moments no longer defined him. They passed through him instead of taking residence. He began therapy, and at first, it drained him. He came home from sessions emotionally exhausted, sitting in silence, staring out the window as if he were piecing himself back together, but gradually the conversation shifted. He stopped questioning whether his feelings were valid and started recognizing patterns for what they were. He learned language for experiences he had never been able to name. Watching that transformation was humbling. Each insight gave him a little more ownership over his story, a little more distance from the nightmare that had once consumed him. There were practical changes too. He found a new place to live. Small but his own, when he invited me over for the first time. It wasn't the furniture that stood out, it was the peace. No tension in the air. No careful monitoring of tone or expression. Just quiet, uncomplicated space. He told me that for the first time in years, he could sit in a room and simply exist. That statement stayed with me long after I left. His marriage officially ended not with shouting or dramatic confrontations, but with paperwork and finality. It wasn't closure in the way movies portray it. There were no perfect last words, but there was relief, a sense of an ending that didn't need to be explained or justified. When it was over, he didn't celebrate, he exhaled, and sometimes. That's what healing looks like as his father. I saw parts of him return that I had missed more than I realized. His humor resurfaced, dry and unforced. His opinions became firmer. He stopped apologizing for taking up space one evening while we were talking about nothing important at all. He laughed and said, almost casually, "I forgot what it felt like to be calm." That moment told me everything I needed to know. He also became more open about his experience, not loudly, not publicly, but honestly with those who mattered. Each time he spoke, the shame lost a little more ground. He learned that his story didn't make him weak, it made him human, and in that honesty, he found connection instead of judgment. He knew how to pause, how to ground himself, how to choose safety again and again. That knowledge was hard-earned, and it changed him in ways that felt permanent, but not damaging. One evening, long after the crisis had passed, we sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon. He turned to me and said something simple, something that felt like the quiet ending of a long chapter. He said he was grateful he had made that call, that if he hadn't, he didn't know where he would be. I felt a tightening in my chest, not from fear this time, but from relief. Because I knew exactly what that call had saved, looking back. That 3 a.m. phone ring wasn't just a moment of crisis. It was a turning point. A doorway out of silence, out of confusion, out of a life that had been slowly shrinking. My son's marriage had become a nightmare, yes, but waking up from it had given him something just as powerful: clarity, resilience, and the courage to begin again. And as I watched him step forward into a life built on honesty and self-respect, I understood something deeply. Sometimes the darkest calls come at the exact moment we're ready to listen. And sometimes answering them is the bravest thing we'll ever do. As I look back now, I understand that night differently. The phone call at 3 a.m. wasn't just a cry for help, it was the moment my son chose to live honestly, even when honesty meant facing fear, shame, and uncertainty. His marriage had become a place where he was slowly disappearing, and answering that call was the first step toward bringing himself back. Healing didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without pain, but it did happen because he spoke and because he was heard. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's this: silence can destroy you, but asking for help can save you. If this story touched you, or if you recognize even a small part of yourself in it, know that you're not alone and that it's never too late to reach out. Please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life stories about courage, healing, and truth. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.